I walked into that room as an intellectual hunter. As a medical student, I didn't just have faith, I had clinical logic. I'd already dismantled dozens of believers, and my roommate David was just another trophy waiting to be claimed. I looked at his Bible and told him point blank, that book is a lie. I expected him to crumble under the weight of my facts. Instead, he just looked up and said, "Go on." That was the moment the game changed. Because what happens when the hunter realizes he's actually the one being pursued by a truth he can't escape? Now, to really understand why I was so relentless with David, you have to understand the world I walked out of. I wasn't just a Muslim by name. I was a Muslim by blood, by heritage, and by every fiber of my being. You see, I came from a long line of missionaries. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, these were men who had dedicated their entire lives to spreading the message of Islam. So, from the moment I could speak, I knew I carried a weight on my shoulders. I wasn't just Nabil, I was the bearer of a legacy. In my home, our faith was beautiful. It was disciplined. It was the foundation of everything we were. My mother, with so much love, taught me the verses of the Quran. My father, a veteran of the Navy, taught me what it meant to be a man of honor and a man of God. I was their pride. I was the chosen son who was going to go into the world, become a doctor, and show everyone the truth of our way. So by the time I arrived at college, I had built this iron armor around myself. It was a suit of armor forged in pride and intellectual certainty. I wasn't just confident, I was arrogant, but I called it conviction. I had spent my childhood memorizing arguments, finding every possible flaw in the Christian faith, and sharpening my tongue for battle. I felt like I was bulletproof. When I looked at a Christian, I didn't see someone I needed to listen to. I saw an opponent. I saw someone who had inherited a corrupted, broken story, and I felt it was my mission, my sacred duty to tear it down. And I was good at it. I had decimated the faith of so many people before I ever met David. I knew how to find the cracks. I knew how to make them feel foolish. And honestly, I enjoyed it. It gave me a sense of power to know that I held the truth and they held a lie. But you have to realize that for me, being right wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about survival. In a culture of honor and shame, your identity is tied to your family's reputation. If I was right about Islam, my family was honored. But if I was even slightly wrong, if I allowed even a shadow of a doubt to creep in, I wasn't just questioning a book. I was betraying my father. I was shaming my mother. I was tearing out the very backbone of my heritage. So I fought. I fought with a clinical intensity. As a medical student, I was trained to be objective, to find the root cause, to diagnose the problem. I looked at Christianity as a pathology, a disease of the mind that needed to be cured. I was the doctor, and they were the patients. I was so blinded by my own intellectual armor that I couldn't see the irony. I was the one in the psychiatry ward, claiming to be God of my own little world, while the great physician was standing right in front of me, waiting for me to just listen. I thought I was defending God. I thought I was protecting the honor of the prophets. But looking back, I realized I was mostly just defending my own ego. I was protecting the version of myself that couldn't afford to be wrong. I was ready for war. I was ready to bring David down. I had the arguments, I had the history, and I had the pride. I was ready, or so I thought. I remember that night specifically. David was sitting there, quietly reading his Bible. And to me, it looked like he was holding a stack of old, corrupted myths. I thought, this is it. This is where his faith falls apart. So I looked at him and said, "David, do you actually believe that book is the Word of God? Think about it logically. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but the New Testament was written in Greek. Then it went into Latin for 1,000 years, then German, then finally English. It's a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. It's like a game of telephone that's lasted 2,000 years. How can you possibly know what the original message even was? I was so sure of myself. I was ready for him to just give up. But David didn't even flinch. He looked at me and said, "Nabil, you're looking at this the wrong way. You think the Bible is like a single line of people whispering in each other's ears. But history doesn't work like that." He asked me to imagine a jigsaw puzzle. Imagine a massive, complex picture that represents the original New Testament. Now imagine that picture was broken into 1,000 pieces. But instead of one person holding all the pieces, those pieces were scattered across the entire world. One person in Egypt has a handful. Another person in Rome has a few. Someone in Syria has another set. Now here is the key. If the person in Rome decides he wants to change his pieces, if he wants to paint over the image to say something else, he can do that. But he can't go to Egypt and change those pieces. He can't go to Syria and change those. So when you bring all those thousands of pieces back together, you can immediately see where the person in Rome tried to cheat. The rest of the puzzle pieces act like a diamond-hard network of evidence that corrects the error. Now let me give you the actual numbers that hit me like a sledgehammer that night. David told me that we don't just have a few old copies. We have over 6,000 early Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And even if we didn't have a single one of those Greek copies, we have over 10,000 translations in Latin, Coptic, and Syriac from the very early centuries of the Church. But David went even further. He said, "Nabil, even if we lost every single manuscript and every single translation, we still have over 30,000 quotations of the New Testament from the early church fathers. We have so many quotes that we could reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament many times over just from their writings alone." I sat there in silence. My mind was racing. As a medical student, I knew how to look at data. I knew how to look for patterns. And what David was describing wasn't a game of telephone. It was a self-correcting, massive network of historical data. Think about the contrast here. I had been taught that the Bible was a mess of corruption. But what I was seeing was a level of historical preservation that was absolutely unprecedented. There is no other book from ancient history, not Plato, not Aristotle, not Homer, that even comes close to this level of evidence. So I looked at him and I said, "David, you're making this up. There is no way we have that much evidence. I've talked to dozens of Christians, and not a single person has ever told me this." He just smiled and said, "Don't take my word for it. Go check the data yourself. You're a scientist, aren't you? Bring your best skepticism. Bring your best arguments. But you better bring it because the truth isn't afraid of your questions." That was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting against a weak, emotional myth. I was fighting against a diamond-hard wall of history. And for the first time in my life, I felt the armor of my pride start to crack. Because if the New Testament was actually reliable, then I had to deal with what it actually said. And what it said was about to destroy the only world I had ever known. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I had one more line of defense. I told myself, fine, maybe the words haven't changed, but that doesn't mean Jesus ever claimed to be God. And so the battle moved from the history of the book to the identity of the man. But deep down, I knew. The logic was starting to win. The data was starting to speak. And for a man who lived by his intellect, that was the most terrifying thing in the world. So we're at this public speaking and debate tournament, and David and I are sharing a room. I see him one night, sitting there, quietly reading his Bible. And honestly, I thought, this is going to be fun. Let's take down another Christian. This will be amusing. I looked at him and I said, "David, do you realize that book you're reading is not trustworthy? It's been corrupted over time." Now, David just closed his Bible and said, "Go on." And that should have been a warning sign for me that this wasn't going to go my way. But I kept going. I laid out my best argument. I said, "David, Jesus spoke Aramaic, right? But the earliest New Testament we have is in Greek. So you already have a translation of Jesus's words before they were ever even written down. Then the church used Latin for 1,000 years. Then it went into German. Then finally, English. It's a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. It's like a game of telephone that's lasted 2 millennia. By the time it gets to you, how can you possibly know what the original message was? I was ready for him to crumple. I had used this on so many Christians before, and it always worked. But David just looked at me and asked, "Nabil, when you spoke to your mom on the phone earlier, was that in English?" I said, "No, it was Urdu." He asked, "But when you told me what she said, you told me in English. Was that a corrupted translation?" I said, "No, I'm multilingual. I can preserve the message across languages." And David said, "Exactly. That's what the disciples did. But it's even stronger than that." Now this is where he hit me with something I wasn't prepared for. He asked me to stop thinking of the Bible as a single chain of whispers and start thinking of it like a massive jigsaw puzzle. Imagine you have a giant, complex puzzle that represents the original New Testament. Now imagine that puzzle was broken into 1,000 pieces, and those pieces were scattered across the entire ancient world. One person in Egypt has a handful. Another person in Rome has a few. Someone in Syria has another set. Now here is the logic. If the person in Rome decides he wants to change his pieces, if he wants to paint over the image to make it say something else, he can do that. But he can't go to Egypt and change those pieces. He can't go to Syria and change those. So when you bring all those thousands of pieces back together from different corners of the world, you can immediately see where the person in Rome tried to cheat. The rest of the puzzle pieces act like a diamond-hard network of evidence that corrects the error. He called it a self-correcting mechanism. And then he gave me the numbers. He told me that we don't just have a few old copies. We have in our possession over 6,000 early Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. He said that if we didn't have any one of those copies, we have over 10,000 translations in Latin, Coptic, and Syriac from the very early church. But then he dropped the hammer. He said, "Nabil, even if we lost every single manuscript in every single translation, we still have over 30,000 quotations of the New Testament from the early church fathers. We have so many quotes from them that we could reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament many times over just from their writings alone." I sat there, and for the first time, my intellectual armor felt heavy. As a medical student, I was trained to look at data. I was trained to look for patterns in evidence. And what David was describing wasn't a game of telephone. It was a diamond network of history. In my mind, I was comparing. I had been told the Bible was a mess of corruption, but the data showed a level of preservation that was absolutely unprecedented. There is no other book from ancient history, not Plato, not Aristotle, not even Homer, that has even a fraction of this kind of evidence. I looked at him and I said, "David, you're making this up." I was desperate. I said, "I've talked to dozens of Christians, and not a single one of them has told me this before." He didn't get angry. He just said, "You think I'm making this up? Fine. Go check the data. You're a scientist. Go look at the archaeology. Go look at the manuscript counts. But you better bring your best game, because the truth isn't afraid of your skepticism." And that was the moment the battle of the manuscripts ended and the battle for my heart began. I realized I wasn't fighting against a weak, emotional myth. I was fighting against a wall of historical facts that was starting to close in on me. But if the New Testament was actually reliable, then I had to deal with the man inside of it. And that was a conversation I wasn't ready to have. Not yet. After 3 years of debating David, after looking at the manuscripts and the historical evidence, we were driving home from a smoothie bar one afternoon, and David asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. He said, "Nabil, we've been at this for a long time. On a scale of 0 to 100, where do you think the case for Christianity stands?" Now, I was a medical student. I was trained to be objective. I had to look at the data. I thought about the crucifixion. Historical scholars, even the atheists, agreed it happened. I thought about the resurrection. The evidence was staggering. So I looked at him and I said, David, I'd put it at about 80 to 85%. He almost spit out his drink. He looked at me and said, then why don't you accept the gospel? And my response was immediate. I said, because I'm 100% sure of Islam. Even if Christianity is 85% likely, the case for Islam is stronger. Now, looking back, that doesn't make any sense, does it? If something is 85% likely to be true, you don't just ignore it. But in that moment, I was a man of reason who was being completely unreasonable. And as a medical student, I should have known why. I was stuck behind a psychological wall that I didn't even know existed. You see, in psychology, there's this thing called cognitive belief perseverance, but I like to call it the identity trap. We like to think that we are like computers, that if you feed us better data, we will change our conclusions. But we aren't computers. We are human beings. When you provide someone with information that contradicts their deepest held beliefs, the things that define who they are, the brain doesn't process that as data. It processes it as a physical attack. When David was breaking down my arguments, my brain wasn't just thinking, oh, that's an interesting historical point. No, my amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for the fight or flight response, was lighting up. It felt like he was throwing a punch at my face. It felt like a threat to my very survival. Why? Because for me, Islam wasn't just what I believed. It was who I was. If Christianity was true, then my grandfather was wrong. My father was wrong. My heritage was a lie. If I accepted that 85%, I wasn't just changing a fact in my head. I was committing social suicide. I was choosing to become a traitor to my bloodline. So, my brain did what every brain does when it feels attacked. It built a wall. It looked at that 15% of doubt and treated it like it was a mountain. I clung to that small margin of uncertainty because I was terrified of what was on the other side of the truth. I told David, I'm certain Islam is true because of the miracles of the Quran. I've heard them since childhood. And David gave me the challenge that changed everything. He said, Nabil, test it. Test Islam with the same level of skepticism you used on Christianity. Apply the same historical criteria. Apply the same rigor. And then tell me what you find. That was the moment I realized I had been living with a double standard. I was a scientist when it came to the Bible, but I was a child when it came to the Quran. I was demanding 100% proof from David, while giving my own traditions a free pass. But I was confident. I said, no problem, I'll do it. I thought my armor was thick enough. I thought my identity was secure. But as I began to apply that critical, clinical eye to the foundations of my own world, the wall didn't just crack, it started to dissolve. I was a man trapped between two worlds. I had the evidence for one, but the heart for the other. I was 85% sure I was heading toward the truth, but I was 100% terrified of what it would cost me to get there. Have you ever felt that? That moment where you know the truth, but you're just not ready? Where your mind has arrived, but your heart is still hiding? I was at the threshold. I was looking through a narrow door at a wedding feast I wasn't allowed to enter. I had the logic, I had the facts, but I was still wearing the armor of my pride, and that armor was too wide to fit through the door. I had to decide, was I going to stay outside with my honor, or was I going to strip everything away and walk through that door alone? The logic had done its work. Now it was time for the soul to speak. And that was a conversation that couldn't happen in a library or a car. It had to happen on my knees. Now, once I had reached the conclusion that the New Testament was historically reliable, I was in a dangerous place. Because as a Muslim, if the book is true, then I have to deal with the person of Jesus. And for me, that was the ultimate hurdle. You see, Muslims love Jesus. We revere him. We believe he was the most miraculous man who ever lived. Some of us even believe he was the only truly sinless prophet. But the moment you say Jesus is God, in a Muslim's eyes, you are committing the worst blasphemy possible. It's called shirk. The Quran is very explicit. If you believe Jesus is God, you will go to hell. There is no middle ground. So I started reading the Gospel of John with a skeptical eye, looking for any way to prove that Jesus never actually made that claim. I opened John chapter 1, and right there in the first verse it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." I kept reading. Verse 14, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." I thought, okay, that's just John's opinion. I want to see Jesus say it. But then I got to John 8:58. The Jews ask him, "You're not even 50 years old, and you claim to have seen Abraham?" And Jesus responds, "Amen, amen, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." Now, if you aren't familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, that might not mean much to you. But when you realize he's taking the very name of the God of Moses, the I am from the burning bush, it hits you like a freight train. He was claiming to be the eternal God. He was claiming to be the God of my ancestors. But as I wrestled with these claims, something else started to seep into my soul. It wasn't just the logic of his deity, it was the nature of his relationship with God. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus keeps using this one word, Father, and he tells his disciples to pray, Our Father. Now you have to understand how radical this was for a Muslim mind. In Islam, the relationship between God and man is strictly that of a master and a slave. We use the word abd. I was a servant of Allah. I was a slave to his will. And there is a certain dignity in being a slave of the Almighty, but there is also a profound distance. You don't commune with a master. You don't have intimacy with a master. You obey. You submit. You hope that at the end of the day your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds so that the master might let you into his garden. But here was Jesus, inviting people into a family. He wasn't talking about a master. He was talking about a father, and he used the word Abba. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's in his darkest hour, he cries out, Abba, Father. Now, Abba isn't just a formal theological term. It is the language of a child. It is daddy. It is papa. It is the most intimate, tender, and secure word a human being can utter. To a Muslim, this was beyond scandalous. It was a revolution. No prophet in the Quran ever dared to call God Father. No angel ever suggested such a thing. To even think it felt like a violation of God's holiness. But as I sat there with the Bible in my lap, the contrast became the mother of clarity. I saw high different worlds. In one world, I was a slave, constantly working, constantly wondering if I had done enough, constantly fearing the judgment of a distant king. In the other world, I was being offered the status of a son who is loved not because he is perfect, but because of whose he is. I began to realize that if Jesus was right, then the veil wasn't just thin, it was torn. God wasn't just sitting on a throne light years away. He was a father who was willing to enter into our filthy, broken world to find his lost children. This was a total reboot of my spiritual DNA. I had spent my life trying to earn a place in the Master's house, only to find out that the Father had been standing at the door all along, waiting for me to come home. I started to ask myself, what if the greatest truth in the universe isn't a law to be followed, but a Father to be known? I was no longer just arguing about manuscripts. I was arguing against the deepest longing of my own heart. I wanted that intimacy. I wanted that Abba. But I knew that to call God Father meant I would lose my earthly father. To become a son of God meant I would become a stranger to my family. The logic was clear, the invitation was beautiful, but the cost was terrifying. I was standing at the threshold of a new world, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being right. By this point, I was intellectually cornered. The logic was done, the evidence was in. But knowing something in your head is a very different thing from accepting it in your heart. As a medical student, I was trained to trust the data, but as a son of a proud Muslim family, I was terrified of where that data was leading me. I needed something more. I needed God to speak to me in a language that my culture understood. Now, you have to understand a bit about Islamic culture. According to our tradition, the veil is still up. We don't believe in a direct, conversational relationship with God. Even the prophets didn't really commune with him. They spoke to angels who spoke to God. But there is one major exception: dreams. Muslims believe that God guides his people through dreams. We ask for them. We base our life decisions on them: where to move, who to marry, what job to take. It is the one way we expect to hear directly from the divine. So I did something desperate. I got on my knees and I prayed. I said, God, I have looked at the evidence, and it looks like Islam isn't true. It looks like Christianity might be, but I can't do this on my own. I need you to tell me who you are. And then God gave me a dream. I found myself standing at the threshold of a narrow door. It was an archway made of brick, just wide enough and just tall enough for me to fit through. As I looked through that doorway, I saw a room set for a massive, beautiful wedding feast. There were round tables and people were sitting in fine clothes, waiting for the feast to begin. I just knew that room was heaven. And I wanted to get in. I wanted to be at that table. But there was a problem. At the other end of that short brick hallway was my friend David. He was sitting there, waiting for the feast to begin, and he was blocking the way. He wasn't looking at me, but his presence meant I couldn't get past him. In the dream, I looked at him and said, I thought we were going to eat together. And David looked at me and said, you haven't responded. I woke up in a cold sweat. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I called David immediately. I asked him, David, what do you think this means? And for the first time, I could hear his eyes rolling over the phone. He didn't even try to interpret it for me. He just said, Nabil, I'm not going to interpret this for you. Just go to the Bible. Read Luke chapter 13. I opened the Bible David had given me, the one I had spent years trying to tear apart, and I turned to Luke 13. And right there, in big, bold letters at the top of the page, it said, the narrow door. My heart skipped a beat. I started reading, and it was like the words were jumping off the page. Jesus was going through the villages, and someone asked him, Lord, are only a few people going to be saved? And he said, make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try, and few will be able. He went on to talk about people sitting at the wedding feast in the kingdom of God, while others are left standing outside, knocking, because the door has been closed. Do you see the impact of that? I had never read that section of the Bible in my life. I didn't even know it existed, but God had placed me right in the middle of a 2,000-year-old parable. He was showing me exactly where I stood. I was at the threshold. I could see the light. I could smell the food. I could see my best friend waiting for me, but I was still standing in the hallway. And why was David the one sitting there? It wasn't because he was my enemy. It was because he was the one who had invited me. For 3 years, he had been holding that invitation out to me, and for 3 years, I had been arguing with him. God was telling me, the evidence is enough. The invitation is clear. The door is open, but you have to move. I was no longer an intellectual hunter looking for a trophy. I was a man who had been found. I realized that God wasn't just a set of historical facts to be analyzed under a microscope. He was a person who was pursuing me. He was the owner of the house, and he was personally calling my name. The logic had cleared the path, but the dreams had opened the door. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew what it would cost. I knew that walking through that door meant leaving my father and mother behind. It meant dragging their honor through the mud. I was standing at the edge of my life as I knew it, looking into a room filled with light. The question wasn't, is this true, anymore. The question was, am I willing to pay the price to enter? After years of arguing, years of investigating, and years of dreaming, I finally reached the point where I couldn't deny the truth anymore. I had intellectually ascended to the gospel, but now came the part I had been dreading every single day of that journey. I had to tell my parents. You see, for a Muslim, especially one from a family of scholars and missionaries like mine, this isn't just about changing your mind. It's not like changing your political party or your career path. This was a total betrayal of everything they had poured into me. I remember that day so vividly. I sat down with my father. Now you have to understand who my father was. He was a 24-year veteran of the United States Navy. To me, he was the archetype of strength. He was my Superman. He was a man who stood tall, a man who had never shown a moment of weakness in my presence. And when I told him, he didn't scream. He didn't get angry. He did something much worse. He cried. I had never seen my father cry in my entire life. And through his tears, he said something to me that I will never forget as long as I live. He said, "Nabil, today I feel as if my backbone has been ripped out from inside me." Now, as a medical student, I knew the anatomy. I knew what the spine did, but I didn't truly understand the weight of that statement until much later. Why did it feel like his backbone was gone? To understand that, you have to understand the world we came from, a world governed by the laws of honor and shame. In Western culture, we focus on guilt and innocence. It's about what you did. But in an Eastern, honor-shame culture, it's about who we are. Honor is the currency of the family. It is the unit of value for the entire tribe. Every achievement I ever had, every grade I earned, every tournament I won, every step I took toward becoming a doctor wasn't just for me. It was a brick being laid to build up the honor of my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. When a son in that culture leaves the faith, he isn't just making a personal choice. He is committing a public execution of his family's reputation. He is dragging their names through the mud in front of the entire community. So when my father said his backbone was ripped out, he wasn't just talking about his emotions. He was talking about his social existence. He was saying that his ability to stand tall in his community, to speak with authority, to be a man of respect, all of that had been paralyzed by my decision. In his eyes, I hadn't just found a new truth, I had become a murderer of his honor. And my mother, she didn't say a word. She just sat there in a silence that was louder than any scream. There had always been a light in her eyes when she looked at me, a light of pride, of hope. And in that moment, it was like I had reached out and just turned that light off. She hasn't been the same since. This is the narrow door I saw in my dream. I finally understood why it was so small. It's because you can't bring your baggage through it. You can't bring your family's expectations. You can't bring your social standing. You can't bring your armor of honor. You have to walk through it completely stripped of everything that used to define you. The cost was right there, sitting across the table from me. It was in the broken voice of my father and the empty eyes of my mother. I had spent my life trying to be their pride, and now I was their greatest shame. But this is what no one tells you about the pursuit of truth. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it breaks your heart first. It forces you to choose between the people you love most in this world and the God who created the world. I fell to my knees after that conversation, and I honestly asked God, why didn't you just kill me? If I was saved, if I was going to heaven, why didn't you take me before I had to do this to them? Everyone would have been happier if I had died a faithful Muslim son. I was mourning. I was grieving for a life that was now shattered beyond repair. But even in that darkness, even with the sound of my father's backbone snapping, echoing in my ears, I realized something. If I loved my father or my mother more than the truth, then I wasn't worthy of the truth. The cost of the gospel for a Muslim today is the same cost the disciples paid 2,000 years ago. It is the cost of everything. But as I looked at the wreckage of my old life, I began to see a different kind of light. It wasn't the light of my family's pride. It was the light of a father who would never leave me, even when my earthly father couldn't stand to look at me. The price was high, but for the first time in my life, I was standing on a foundation that no amount of shame could ever shake. I finally reached the point where I couldn't deny it. The evidence was in, the logic was settled. But then came the part I had been dreading every single day of that journey. I had to tell my parents. You see, as a medical student, I was trained to be objective. I was trained to look at the data and follow it wherever it led. But as a son in a proud Muslim home, I knew that following this specific data was going to cost me everything. It wasn't just about changing my mind. It was about breaking a legacy. I remember that day so vividly. I sat down with my father. Now you have to understand who my father was. He was a 24-year veteran of the United States Navy. To me, he was the archetype of strength. He was my Superman. He was a man who stood tall, a man who had never shown a moment of weakness in my presence. And when I told him, he didn't scream. He didn't get angry. He did something much worse. He cried. I had never seen my father cry in my entire life. And through his tears, all he said was this: "Nabil, today I feel as if my backbone has been ripped out from inside me." Now, as a medical student, I knew the anatomy. I knew exactly what the spine did. But I didn't truly understand the weight of that statement until that moment. Why did he feel like his backbone was gone? To understand that, you have to understand the world we came from, a world governed by the laws of honor and shame. In Western culture, everything is about guilt and innocence. It's individualistic. It's about what you did. But in an Eastern, honor-shame culture, it's about who we are. Honor is the currency of the family. It is the unit of value for the entire tribe. Every achievement I ever had, every grade I earned, every tournament I won, every step I took toward becoming a doctor wasn't just for me. It was a brick being laid to build up the honor of my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. When a son in that culture leaves the faith, he isn't just making a personal choice. He is committing a public execution of his family's reputation. He is dragging their names through the mud in front of the entire community. So when my father said his backbone was ripped out, he wasn't just talking about his emotions. He was talking about his social existence. He was saying that his ability to stand tall in his community, to speak with authority, to be a man of respect, all of that had been paralyzed by my decision. In his eyes, I hadn't just found a new truth. I had become a murderer of his honor. I had effectively rendered him a social paraplegic. And my mother? She didn't say a word. She just sat there in a silence that was louder than any scream. There had always been a light in her eyes when she looked at me, a light of pride, of hope. And in that moment, it was like I had reached out and just turned that light off. She hasn't been the same since. This is the narrow door I saw in my dream. I finally understood why it was so small. It's because you can't bring your baggage through it. You can't bring your family's expectations. You can't bring your social standing. You can't bring your armor of honor. You have to walk through it completely stripped of everything that used to define you. The cost was right there, sitting across the table for me. It was in the broken voice of my father and the empty eyes of my mother. I had spent my life trying to be their pride, and now I was their greatest shame. But this is what no one tells you about the pursuit of truth. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it breaks your heart first. It forces you to choose between the people you love most in this world and the God who created the world. I went back to my apartment after that conversation, and I just fell on my knees. I started crying so hard I couldn't even breathe. I was repeating the same thing over and over again. I asked God, "Why didn't you just kill me? Why didn't you kill me, God?" Because think about it. If I had died before I told them, I would have died a believer. I would be in heaven. They would be happy. I would be happy. We would all be happy. Why did I have to stay alive just to do this to them? I was mourning. I was grieving for a life that was now shattered beyond repair. But in that moment, in the middle of all that mucus and tears and agony, I heard a voice in my spirit, and it only said one thing: because this is not about you. In that second, my entire world was rebooted. My theology, my purpose, my everything. I realized that the cost I was paying, as high as it was nothing compared to the price Jesus paid to find me. The price for a Muslim to follow Christ is the same price the disciples paid 2,000 years ago. It is the cost of everything. But as I looked at the wreckage of my old life, I began to see a different kind of light. It wasn't the light of my family's pride. It was the light of a father who would never leave me, even when my earthly father couldn't stand to look at me. The backbone of my old life was gone, but I was being given a new one made of the truth that no amount of shame could ever break. After I walked away from that conversation with my father, my world felt like it had been incinerated. I went back to my apartment and I just collapsed. I was on my knees, sobbing with tears and mucus and spit just covering my face. I was broken, and I started repeating a prayer that probably sounds insane to most people. I was begging God, "Why didn't you just kill me? Why didn't you take my life before they found out?" You see, my medical training had taught me how to save lives, but in that moment, I wanted to lose mine. I thought that if I had died just a few days earlier, everyone would be better off. I would be with God, my parents would still have their honor, and the backbone of our family would still be intact. I was looking for a way out of the pain. I was looking for a Control-Z for my life. But right there, in the middle of all that agony, I heard a voice in my spirit. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. It said, "Because this is not about you." In that second, my entire perspective was rebooted. All my medical logic, all my intellectual pride, all my personal grief, it all came crashing down before a higher truth. I realized that my life was no longer my own property. I had been asking for a quick, quiet exit so I could be comfortable, while God was calling me to a loud, difficult mission for the sake of others. Looking back now, there is a strange, almost haunting irony in that specific prayer. You see, many of you know how the story ends. Just about a decade after that prayer, at the age of 34, I was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer. I was a doctor, and I knew exactly what the scans were telling me. I was looking at a death sentence. And that's where the paradox of suffering hits you the hardest. Some might look at my life and say that God finally answered that death prayer from years ago. They might say it's a tragedy that a man who fought so hard to find the truth was taken away right when he was at the peak of his influence. But if you think that, you're still looking at it through the lens of you. Think about those 12 years between my conversion and my diagnosis. If God had answered my prayer to die in that apartment, those 12 years wouldn't have happened. The books I wrote wouldn't exist. The thousands of conversations I had with people searching for truth wouldn't have happened. The bridge I tried to build between two worlds would never have been laid. God refused my request for a quiet death so he could give me a life that actually meant something. He took my backbone of honor and replaced it with a backbone of purpose. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I didn't ask, "Why me?" anymore, because I already knew the answer. Because this is not about you. Even in the hospital bed, even when I was losing my hair and my strength, the mission didn't change. My suffering was just another platform to show the world that Jesus is worth it. There is a profound legacy that can only be built from ashes. We often think that a blessed life is a long, comfortable one, but history tells a different story. The lives that echo the loudest in eternity are often the ones that were cut short in the eyes of the world. My time was limited. I was a medical student who became a patient, a hunter who became a witness. I only had 12 years to do the work of a lifetime, but those 12 years were more alive than a century of sitting in the dark. If you are going through your own backbone-ripping moment right now, If you feel like your life is a wreckage, don't ask God to just end the pain. Ask Him to use it. Realize that the very thing that is breaking you might be the thing that God is using to build something eternal. My story isn't a tragedy about a man who died young. It's a testimony about a man who was finally allowed to truly live. Because once you realize that your life is not about you, you finally become free to give it all away. And in giving it away, you find a life that even cancer can't touch, and even death can't take. My life was short, yes, but it was enough, because it was His. I walked outside the next morning, and I know this sounds like a cliche, but it's the honest truth. Everything looked different. It was the same apartment complex, the same trees, the same cracked pavement on the street, but I was seeing it all through a completely different lens. I remember seeing someone walking across the street, just a stranger, going about their day. I had seen people do that a million times before, but for the first time in my life, I didn't just see a person. I realized that is someone God was willing to die for. Think about that for a second. As a Muslim, my entire life was built on the idea that God sat on a distant throne. He ruled us from above. He gave us a list of things to do, and He would judge us at the end of time. But the story of the gospel is that the God who created the stars, the God who thought the universe into existence, was willing to enter this filthy, broken world. He was willing to live as a carpenter, a blue-collar laborer. He was willing to live among people He knew would eventually betray Him. And then He was willing to go to a cross and suffer the most agonizing death imaginable for the sake of sinners, for the sake of that person crossing the street, for the sake of me. In that moment, I realized what it actually means to follow Jesus. He told us, "As I have loved you, so love one another." If I'm willing to watch someone walk by and just let them go about their day without loving them enough to be ready to die for them, then how am I actually following Him? What does it mean to be a follower of a God who died for His enemies if I'm not willing to give up my comfort for my friends? I realize that the gospel isn't just a set of facts you believe so you can go to heaven. If it doesn't reboot your entire theology of people, if it doesn't change the way you look at a stranger, then it hasn't hit you yet. This God is worth everything. This story is worth sharing with our very lives. My journey started with a desire to decimate someone else's faith. I was the hunter, armed with logic and pride. But I ended up being the one who was captured by a love I couldn't argue with. I had to pay a price. I lost my family's honor. I lost my father's respect. I eventually lost my health at a young age. But as I stand here, looking back at the wreckage of the life I thought I wanted, I can tell you this: the truth is worth the cost. If you're listening to this and you're standing at that narrow door, paralyzed by the fear of what you might lose, I want to challenge you. Don't just take my word for it. Don't just watch my story as a piece of entertainment. Put your own worldview to the test. Bring your best skepticism. Bring your hardest questions. But do it with a heart that is actually seeking the truth, not just trying to protect your ego.